Hello everybody, this is Catholic Dad, episode number 371, BLM, Black Lives Matter, Won't End Well. And so I wanted to actually give my perspective, a little bit of historical perspective today. I wanted to start off by saying that I'm under the impression, just a little disclaimer, that humanity is a good thing and that people, human beings are actually good to the planet for the most part. And we all have our fallen natures and our own sinful natures. But for the most part, I think if we work together and we work forward, we walk forward together hand in hand in collaboration, that we can come to a brighter future. That's my disclaimer for you, and I hold zero animus towards anybody. I don't hold any animus towards Black Lives Matter crowd. I don't hold any animus towards the counter-protesters and so on and so forth. I also wanted to address the counter-protesters today, the people that are walking the streets with high caliber rifles, assault rifles, and so on and so forth, that are trying to dissuade violence. At least that's their impression, or I mean that's their intent. And so I believe that the Black Lives Matter protests are well intended. I also believe that the counter protesters are equally well intended. And now there's somewhat of a conflict. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about history here. And so Black Lives Matter is kind of, it's a counter-protest against the authority, right? It's a protest against the police state of the United States of America. And in my mind, no doubt the United States of America has become more of a police state in the last 20, 30, 40 years than it used to be. And I think they have a legitimate gripe here. Now, here's the one thing I actually want to warn about, and I don't know if anybody's ever read the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but he was a good communist in Soviet Russia. He fought for the Soviets, he fought against the Germans in World War I, but eventually he started speaking out against the mob, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the progressive communism that was trying to create equality for all people. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but the groupthink that was Bolshevism and the groupthink that is perhaps Black Lives Matter as well. When I say groupthink, mob mentality, because it kind of is, they can be super well intended to begin with, but sometimes the mission can morph, and the mission did morph in the name of communism for sure. Joseph Stalin was personally responsible for, in his little reign of terror in the 30s all the way up into the 50s, for ending the lives of approximately 50 million of his own fellow countrymen. He starved out approximately 6 million farming rural people in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. And then he exported his ideology to Asia, and Maoist China killed about 65 million of their own countrymen. And all in all, these groupthink revolutions have touched many, many countries throughout the globe. Even in our own little country of Mexico to our south, our neighbors, they killed approximately 200,000 people under the hands of the Calles government, the foot of the federales. Good people were killed at the hands of groupthink and communism. And so Alexander Solzhenitsyn was part of that movement because he was a good communist, but he started questioning why so many people were being killed and there was so much violence associated with communism. Well, anyway, what happened? Somebody got his hands on his letter that he wrote to his buddy, and they arrested him. And he was actually a soldier for Russia at that point in time. So he gets arrested by his commanding general, and he gets moved over into a Gulag Archipelago, or a Soviet work camp, and he spends 8 years of his life. He gets lymphoma, he gets cancer, and he gets tortured essentially, and he has a lot of time to actually think about what is wrong with the Soviet Union and how did this decay of his society occur. And what he determined was this. He determined that what was wrong with the Soviet Union was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that the groupthink mentality that occurred, and the centralization of everybody wanting equality and justice and fraternity and everything else, it created this mob-type communistic mentality. And the problem with Russia was that Alexander Solzhenitsyn didn't stand against it. He didn't actually give any kind of meaningful, voiceful resistance. And that Alexander Solzhenitsyn determined the problem with Soviet communism was Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself. Now that should make us take pause in the Black Lives Matter movement, that perhaps what is wrong with police and justice in America? Well, let's take some pause. Is it all the police? Well, it might not be. Some of it may actually be black culture. 1/3 of all young blacks are incarcerated at some point in their lives, black males. And I'm not saying that they deserve it at all, but I am saying that the culture does make a conflict immediately with some kind of police as well as young black men. And so automatically the cops are kind of nervous about policing young black men. Now, all that being said is, why are blacks arrested at higher rates? Some of it probably has to do with injustice and being targeted by the police, but also some of it may have to be due that they do actually more crime, and it is possible. And part of that may be the breakdown of the black family. Once in America, the black family was the pinnacle of like stability. Back in the 1950s, I think like 10% of blacks were born out of wedlock, and now it's up to, I think, 70 to 80% of black people. And so when Alexander Solzhenitsyn looked at himself and said, I'm the problem with communism, even though he rejected communism and moved forward, maybe we should look at that in terms of our own personal lives and say, why is there this injustice in America? And perhaps we could change our own hearts. I mean, that's what Alexander Solzhenitsyn did. Well, Alexander Solzhenitsyn eventually got he got kicked out of Russia. He wrote a bunch of books, Cancer Ward, Gulag Archipelago, 1914, so on and so forth. And he became a hero speaking out out against the ills of communism. And I mean, that's how he tried to change the world. And he's still one of the greatest literary writers of all time. But one of the warnings is this: the mob mentality is, once you get a mob mentality and it's moving in a certain direction, and then like you're agreeing with it and everybody's agreeing in the mob, when you stop agreeing with the mob, how do you get out of the mob? And because what is that line in the sand that people are calling for, that line in the sand of justice? That's a real question for you. Like, because George Floyd, he was killed unjustly by a police officer. I genuinely believe it. And so how do you get justice in that case? Well, you arrest the cop and you charge him appropriately, and then you try him. That is justice. Well, that happened, yet it wasn't enough to quell the desire for justice, and so the mob moves forward. And so the mob's moving forward, and what happens when they start doing violence is the mob start breaking apart and people start speaking out against the mob. Well, I can tell you, there's not 1 in 1,000 people inside a mob with passion and emotion that has the moral capacity to actually stand up and be a voice of reason. And there's certainly not 1 in 10,000 that has the capacity to actually stop the mob and bring them back to an unimpassioned, reasonable position. Because once the mob gets going, it could loot cities, it could burn things, it could kill people. And we've seen this. Homicides are up 250% in America since the protests started about George Floyd. Now, right, you got to think about it. The mob is very strong. Now, this is only the beginning, by the way. This is only going to get worse and worse and worse as we progress in the future if the mob mentality keeps taking part, or it keeps progressing. Now, I'm going to warn the counter-protesters too, by the way. You think you're well-intended, and you think you're going to try to stop these people from harming your communities. Indeed, you may be, but I want to introduce you to a book called Ordinary Men. Ordinary Men is a book about German police back in World War II. So what happened was the German government marched into Poland because they wanted to go into the cradle of communism and destroy it. And they had to do some atrocities. I mean, they did atrocities to the Polish people. And so they needed to police the Polish people while they were there. And they asked for some of the cops to help out. And the cops did, and they were there. And eventually the military said, listen, you're just ordinary police officers. You're ordinary men. You guys can go home. You don't need to see the travesties of war. And they said, well, we kind of want to help out. You know, we don't really want to go back to Germany. And so Ordinary Men is about the morphing of men from well-intended police, right, trying to do the right thing, to the same people that are putting the guns to the back of infants, back of the head of infants and pulling the trigger. The same men that are actually in the charge of Nazi prison guards. Ordinary Men is about the morphing psychology of somebody who's trying to do right into somebody that does atrocities. And if you're out there with an assault rifle on the streets of America right now, you should read this book, because if you think you have the moral capacity when things go bad and the mobs start rising to not sit there and lay some bullets downrange into your fellow countrymen, I think you're probably mistaken. And so all that being said is, if you're in the mob, I mean, if you're the counter-protester with the rifles, so you got to look into your own hearts, people, because while Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, the problem with Soviet Russia was himself, the same problem with the ordinary men are themselves as well. If you're not in charge of your passions, if you're not in charge of like addiction, if you're not in charge of your heart, and then you should not have a rifle, and you should not be policing your own fellow countrymen. You have to go deep down in your heart. And I want to introduce you to a topic called meekness. Meekness is a virtue. So if you're out there with a rifle, like a lot of people hear the word meekness and they think weakness. It's not true. It means a strong, powerful person with the capacity to do great harm, but choosing not to. And the only way that you can be meek, these people on the street should be meek, by the way, I want to say that. You should have the capacity to do great harm, but you have to be the master of your own heart. So to temper your emotions when things get really hot. And when you have crowds of protesters meeting up with counter-protesters and there's violence, well, you better know you're in charge of your own emotive state before you pick a rifle up and take your own fellow countrymen down. And so these are the warnings for both sides of the argument, by the way. We got the BLM movement, and for all intents and purposes, I believe it's probably well-intended, but for all intents and purposes, it does appear as if it probably is mob mentality. And the last 100 years, all you have to be is a little bit of a student in history and realize that the mob mentality can cause irreparable harm and damage and create hell on earth if it goes unchecked. And for all intents and purposes, the people that are trying to stop the mob mentality, that they can unleash hell on earth as well, trying to do what's right, stopping the mob mentality. And so the situation right now, if you don't think you have the moral capacity to stop an impassioned crowd from looting and pillaging and rioting, and you're within the BLM movement and you're trying to actually rally for justice, then you should go home, because then you'll become part of the mob and you could do great harm to your fellow countrymen. And you, in the counter-protest movement, if you're carrying rifles and you're trying to protect your communities against the mob mentality, and you yourself are not in charge of your own heart, if you have an alcohol problem or a drug problem or your fornication problem or a pornography problem, if you actually don't have the capacity to keep your lower appetites in check, then you should go home. And if you actually think about this, by the way, not 1 in 1,000 people have the capacity to stand against the mob. They just don't. Nobody has that kind of moral courage. Very few people have that kind of moral courage. And how many people with firearms are meek and they're in charge of their own heart? Very few people have mastered that. And I'll tell those people with firearms, by the way, you don't have to be good at meekness. That's not good enough. You have to be the masters of meekness. You have to be the master of your own heart if you're out there and you think you have the moral capacity to police your own fellow countrymen like that. And so anyway, this is Catholic Dad making you think about it. I don't think this is going to end well. I don't see a line in the sand where the mob of the Black Lives Movement matter is going to stop, because I thought we already reached it when the police officers were under arrest and charged with murder. Like, I thought that was justice, but perhaps it's not. But when does justice come? What if they reform all the police laws? What if they stop policing black people? You could actually, by the way, end up with apartheid in this country if we're not very careful. And then, by the way, we could also take down the entire authority of the United States of America, and we can end up with anarchy. And if that happens, the strong man always rises, people. And the last century is replete with example of murderous authoritarian regimes. And I fear, by the way, the United States of America is going that way. I think the people in the Black Lives Matter, while their own individual intents are good, I think the mob mentality is very, very dangerous. And people with the rifles that are trying to stop them, while their own intent is very, very good, I think if they haven't analyzed their heart in terms of mastering meekness, they should go home too. And if you look at it, like, let's say there's, I don't know, 1 million people doing this on both sides, right? Almost all of them should go home. They really should. And then they should try to master their own communities and change the laws that are better for their own future security. That's the way America is supposed to work. And so I'm nervous about the future of America, people. And I love people dearly. I think both sides of the argument. I think I love all people. But I do not see this ending well with two well-intended factions opposing each other. Think about that for a second. That's how Soviet communism happened. That's how 200,000 people were murdered at the hands of their own governments last century. Well-intended people trying to go for égalité, fraternité, justice, and so on and so forth. and they end up in murderous regimes. And so think about that. Read those two books, by the way, Gulag Archipelago and Ordinary Men. They're enlightening. And the key is, if you're reading those books, pretend like you're in that time. Like, would you have been able to oppose these people? Because it was a murderous, horrible hell. Did you have the courage to stand up against it in the light of starvation or torture or so on and so forth? I doubt it. I doubt it. And if you think you did, then you're hubristic. You're prideful, and you need piety in your own heart. And so, anyway, God bless you. Get back to Mass, everybody. Live a sacramental life, and do pray the daily rosary for peace, by the way, and for the future of our nation. God bless you all.